Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Frannie Eberhardt. I'm the president of Friends of the Upper East Side. And it's lovely to have you all here this evening for a very special treat, learning about terracotta from Susan Tunick. If you don't know Friends, I think many of you have been on our Zooms before, but if you don't know us, we're a group that was founded in 1982, and we're dedicated to the architectural legacy, the livability, and the sense of place of the Upper East Side. We are very involved in zoning issues as well, and it is a very stressful time right now, a lot going on. So stay tuned with us, and also, especially tonight, to welcome Susan Tunick. I'm very grateful to Susan for doing this for us. Many of you may know her and know her work. If you do, you probably learned about terracotta from her. I think I vaguely knew that the Romans worked in terracotta, and I knew it meant baked earth roughly, but that was it until I met Susan a bunch of years ago now. And I'm indebted to her, we all are, for this understanding of this incredible material that is everywhere, but we just aren't aware of it. Something else that you're not probably aware of is that Susan is a very accomplished artist. She works, not surprisingly, in ceramics, tile, and brick. And she does both private commissions, and also you find public art by Susan. She has some work in subways. So multi-talented and very generous to do this for us. We will be taking questions by the chat. So just bring your questions into the chat as we go along, and then Lara will monitor questions and a little Q&A time at the end. I should also mention, and you'll hear more about this later, Susan is an author of a number of books, and the most beautiful of them all is this one called Terracotta Skyline. It's spectacularly interesting, and also the photography by her brother, if I'm not mistaken, is really lovely. So you'll have a chance to get that for yourself. Later we'll give you the information. So I think I will turn this over to Susan for a nice walk around terracotta in New York City.
Thank you, Frannie. I want to make sure you can hear me. Can I be heard? Yes? Okay, great. Well, first of all, it's great that it's a virtual walking tour because it's not very nice out, and walking in the rain makes it very difficult to hear the leader. So I'm delighted to be sheltered and indoors. But I have found that the request that Frannie had, she emailed me to say, well, you have a wonderful walking tour booklet. Is it on PDF, and can we just have an event with it? And I said, oh, it's not on PDF, it's quite old. And but I would be interested in trying to do a virtual walk. And I've found it to be quite a challenge, because the main goal usually of the walking tours is to try to teach people to identify terracotta. If you can identify it, you can own it, in a sense that you can feel more confident about what you're looking at. And since it's in so many places and sometimes hard to detect, that's often a goal. Now, not having the buildings in front of you makes it even harder and trickier to try and teach you. But let's do our best. And what I thought we'd do is start with very brief topic of what is terracotta, and Frannie's stolen the thunder, which is great. It's burnt earth. And also try to follow up with how it's made very briefly. I am really making this short. And then we'll look at a walk which is from the walking tour booklet. I wanted to mention that because I always give out material on a walk for people to be able to refer to later, we've put into the chat the map, and you'll notice that there are black dots on the map. Those are additional buildings that I couldn't add into today's talk, because usually a walk is 3 hours, and we are not planning on any 3 hours tonight. So that explains what the black dots are. I also prepared a list of all the buildings, architects, and dates, and you will find the map, the list, and information about Friends of Terra Cotta's website in case you're interested in publications or knowing the organization or certainly joining us. All of those are in the chat, and you'll be able to download them at your convenience. So I think that may help you in the course of the evening or after the evening if you want to refer to something. So the first thought is that terracotta is literally burnt earth, but it's a fine clay. It's a hard grain, fine clay that's usually fired to about 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. And terracotta is typically found on exterior facades of buildings. Although what you're looking at here is an interior and a fabulous building, the New Amsterdam Theater. So there are some wonderful examples of interior terracotta, but basically it's used as an exterior material. And the blocks are roughly, as you'll see in the next image, typical blocks are small. They're 4 inches thick and maybe 12 or 18 inches in dimensions. This is the most typical. We will see bigger pieces, and there are giant pieces now. In the traditional manufacture, pieces were kept to the size where 2 people could carry them, put them in the kiln, unload them, glaze them. Now we have forklifts, and so there are some enormous pieces that are being made. It's shocking. But to go back for a second, the way that you make terracotta, and this is one of probably 4 ways, but it's the most traditional way. The others are more contemporary, including using laser, all kinds of great laser technology for preparing the molds. But here you have a plaster mold, and it's broken down. There would be 4 sides and a bottom, and the clay would be pressed into the mold, which you'll see in the next image. And you need to leave the clay in the mold until it's leather hard, which means that it is hard enough to be removed without it changing shape. It's then finished in the finishing department. But let's just look at this image on the left, which is from Gladding, McBean and Company in Lincoln, California. And they, here you see a mold being put together by one of the workers, and the previous 2 molds have been put together. You can see a black band, which is used to hold the molds tight, because there's a lot of pressure when you're pressing the clay into the mold. Also, you see a back with a line through it, which is a clay wall. The clay walls or joints, or whatever you want to refer to them as, are really important to keep the clay from warping when it's drying and being fired. It's a stabilizing element. When the piece is leather hard, the straps are removed. You undo the pieces so that you have your 5 pieces of plaster. And if you look at the slide on the right, you see a workman unmolding a piece, but it's a much, much more complicated piece and has many parts to it. So that is a rather atypical mold, but that's basically the process. Mix the clay, press it into a mold, let it harden, finish it off, glaze it, fire it. And the glazing is usually done when the clay is dry but raw. So it's not fired first the way pottery would be fired. Pottery is fired usually for bisque firing at a low temperature, and then a glaze firing at a higher temperature. It's too expensive to do that with terracotta, and generally the industry learned how to do it successfully, so it's not really a problem. Now comes the question of how to recognize terracotta. And there are about 5 ways that I'm going to suggest tonight. There are more in the guidebook, but it's too many. So the most basic is color. If you see color, you can't be guaranteed that it's terracotta. It certainly can be paint, but terracotta is the only exterior material that will hold its color. So if you take a good look at the surface of whatever it is that's colored, you'll begin to get an idea of whether or not it could be terracotta. Paint peels, chips rather readily, which terracotta does not in general, well-made terracotta. So the first and easiest characteristic is color. The second characteristic that I always think of is that if you've looked at the surface and you think it's a glaze, you can see these little crazed lines in the bambino's head and shoulder. Those little lines will help you determine that it's terracotta. They're called crazing, and it's a network of lines that's often found, sometimes much more subtle than this and sometimes not, because the clay and glaze shrink slightly differently, and there's usually some coefficient of expansion that occurs in the glaze that creates this tiny series of lines. And I'll just show you, for example, if we go back one, if you look closely here in the bottom piece on the right, you will see crazed lines. So it's very common, and that can be very helpful. Another very useful thing to recognize is crispness. When you look at the feet, for example, the hooves of this creature and the legs, you can see that it's very crisp. Compare it with the brownstone below. I don't know if you can see, but this is called defoliation, where the layers of the brownstone are falling away because of the way that it's actually made in nature. Below that is a brick, which is in very nice shape. So you've got two pieces of clay and one brownstone area, and the brownstone is not crisp. Here's another example where this face must have melted so much that someone tried to replace it and resculpt it, but it's very soft. It doesn't have any of that sharpness that you would definitely find in terracotta. Okay, another approach is to look at deterioration, and there are many kinds of deterioration, but one of the easiest things is to see chips, and you get tiny chips like the 63rd Street Y. You can see just in here that the clay body is underneath, and that it's not a pure solid one matrix. It's got things in it. Even in this piece, you can see little black dots. You can see dots and markings up here. So if the piece has a chip anywhere, what you will see is the clay body below, which is usually a buff or beige. Red clay, which is used for terracotta also, would not be used frequently when something has glaze over it, because the red has iron and will bleed into the glaze and change the color. So you're likely to find a light colored body underneath the glaze surface. That's worth looking for. And chips we used to have a saying that Margot Gale gave out magnets for the Friends of Cast Iron, and the Friends of Terracotta gave out little hammers so you could bang against a building, but we're not recommending that. No banging, just if it's damaged already, you'll see. The last thing I wanted to point out is that the size of the joints tells you a great deal about the material. And when I say size, I'm not speaking correctly, but I should really say the number of joints. So the number of joints in a facade will help you determine whether something is clay or is stone. And these are clay blocks on the left that are large. You know, they're moderate in size. This is a pretty good sized piece. But you can see the joints regularly, and the pieces are not really huge. Here you can see much smaller pieces and the frequent joints. So if you pay attention to the number of joints or where they are and how big is the piece, that'll help you to determine whether something is terracotta. So we've finished that lesson, and we're going to move on to our walk. This walk is from Murray Hill to Gramercy Park. And I wanted to read a little bit to you about the neighborhood from the guidebook. Residential development first occurred in Murray Hill during the 1850s, when elegant stone houses were constructed for wealthy New Yorkers, such as the Vanderbilts. During the 1890s, many houses were built that used terracotta. One of the finest remaining examples is the Hampton Rob Residence, where our walk begins. Commercial development moved into the area around 1900, and the exclusive character of the neighborhood was somewhat altered. Further south of Murray Hill is a district of interesting commercial buildings, two of which are favorites, 2 Park Avenue and 261 Fifth Avenue. The Gramercy area has terracotta ornament on a number of wonderful apartment buildings and a terrific school. We'll look at 34 Gramercy Park, our last building, and it's the oldest one on this walk from 1883. And exuberant Deco buildings from the late 20s, like George and Edward Blum's 22nd Street apartment house. The proximity of commercial and residential structures and the consequent mingling of varied activities within each city block, especially evident in this walk, is one of the things that makes architectural terracotta really exciting. So we have on the screen the Hampton Rob Residence. He was a financier who served in the 1880s as the Commissioner of Parks for New York City. And the Robb Mansion was the site of many elite social gatherings. It was in the family until 1923, when it was purchased by the New York Advertising Club. And in 1923, it became their home. By the early 1980s, it was converted to co-ops, and it remains a co-op today. With it is landmarked, and so it's in a nice, stable situation. The restoration that was carried out on it a number of years ago was quite good. And I'd like to just point out, before we look at the next slide of details, that the ground floor and the baluster here on the balcony and above are brownstone, and the columns are stone. Obviously, the facade is brick, and then we have beautiful beige terracotta ornament. Let's look at the next slide. I have a very interesting mouse that has a mind of its own, so we will do some odd things because the mouse will do it no matter what. Here you get a chance to see a cleaned facade, and you see on the right the kind of burnt orange brick that's used, and you get to see the cleaned terracotta. It's interesting to note on the right, just look at these 2 blocks, okay? And this is very helpful in determining terracotta. It probably didn't please the makers, or maybe Mcalpin White, but it shows you the variation in the firing temperatures and also atmosphere that will happen in a kiln. And so pieces vary. They're not all uniform. That's a plus in many ways. It can be a minus in some ways, but the industry considered a plus. And if you actually even look at the dirty facade, where you can see darker blocks, lighter blocks, that variation you will find in terracotta, not really in stone. So that's something also to think about when you're looking at buildings. The shields are quite wonderful, and it's nice that they stretch sort of from window to window. I think you can see here that the brownstone has some indication of water absorption right through here, something that doesn't occur in this way visually with terracotta. So from the Robb Mansion, we're going to move down from 35th and Park Avenue to 34th to 33rd. And you're looking at the Vanderbilt Hotel. It was completed in 1913, so this had to be a photo after 1913 and before the late 1920s, because next to the Vanderbilt Hotel is a smaller building than what is there now, and we will look at that in a moment, but it helps us with the time frame of the picture since there's no identification for that time. Well, this is a kind of sad story. These amazing arches, and you can see them better here, terracotta. They were made by the Hartford Faience Company. And you can see a Xerox of an image from an old journal showing the ornament. This is my mouse, my wonderful mouse, sorry. And in 1967, there was a radical alteration of the building. The lower floor where the arches are, the lower two floors were modernized, the arches destroyed. And there was a very serious destruction inside the building, which we'll look at in a moment. I did want to point out the fact that there's very nice ornament on the upper levels, including these very large terracotta heads, which we'll see a detail of, but also there were shields with an A and a V that were for Alfred Vanderbilt, who built this hotel on the site of his family's home. He did not get to enjoy the hotel because he perished in the Lusitania, which was sunken by a German submarine in 1915. We'll go to the next image and see the we may, but this mouse, very large heads at the top of the building. There's terracotta here, there's terracotta throughout. You can tell it's terracotta because there's some terrible cracking all along this area, and that's very common when there's water infiltration. But we'll move on to the sad story of the inside. The Della Robbia room, which was the largest installation of rookwood pottery in the country, was destroyed in '67 to turn it into a parking garage. It's still a parking garage, and you can go in and you can walk on the marble floors that were part of the Della Robbia room. Rookwood is a very well-known ceramics company that did pottery, terracotta, tile. They're from Cincinnati, Ohio, and very well respected. They also did some work in the subway system. So once we learned about the destruction of the Della Robbia bar, which I learned from an architect maybe in 1980 or so, we paid particular attention to another interior that was very highly respected, the Mcalpin Hotel, which had an incredible room filled with murals of the ships and the history of New York's harbor. And we made a giant effort to try to save it, but it was destroyed before we could get the Landmarks Commission to agree to even calendar it. And one of the janitors who saw what was going on made a comment that was quite unforgettable. He says, "They're destroying antiquity. What are they doing?" And that's what they did. They put it all in the dumpster. We were able to get the destruction stopped and the murals saved, but much of the rest of the room was destroyed, and some of them have been reinstalled in the subway system. This long story is because this is what led to us searching for getting the Della Robbia bar, which you see on the screen, saved, or it was called the Men's Crypt. It's a much smaller room, far less ornamental than the Della Robbia room, but it's been saved, it's landmarked, and it has wonderful rookwood on the ceilings. You can see the colors and the motifs, and also Guastavino tile. for the domes. So if you have a chance, it's now Wolfgang's Steakhouse. It's noisy, it's crowded, it's expensive, but it's fun to go there and they appreciate it. And you can just look and don't need to eat, or you can have a light meal. So we'll move on to the very next block. And here's the Vanderbilt Building, the hotel. And we're right now on Park Avenue South. And we're at 33rd to 32nd at 2 Park Avenue by Ely Jacques Kahn. And this building has a very nice unity to it. It's not in its pristine original condition. The ground floors have been altered some, but it is now a landmark, and it will be well cared for. What's interesting is, for me, there's a lot of continuity throughout the building, a lot of verticality, a sense of horizontals. Then you have these setbacks with incredibly colored and formed terracotta. So we'll look a little more closely at those. But I just wanted to mention that Lewis Mumford wrote in 1928, a year after the building was complete, that the building strikes the boldest and clearest note among all our recent achievements in skyscraper architecture. And the next image will give you a better view of a drawing which showed the upper stories. And this drawing is really recreated in real life right here in the building. So you see these details are here. And this area is just, yeah, right here. The squares are here. And so that really the building actually followed this drawing. There were not a whole lot of changes. I wanted to point out something about Kahn. He's one of my favorite architects because of his use of color and texture. He was very interested in tapestry and also in ceramics. And he actually had a ceramic prayer niche from an Isnik niche in his home that he had purchased on traveling. What he does is use ornament in different kinds of ways. So he's using colored ornament at the top here and below as very strong geometric colors and forms. And then he goes and uses a very monochromatic kind of orange beige for areas between windows and beneath the setback. And they're very simple, but they have a lot of texture to them. So they reflect a lot of light. So he's using color, strong color and shape. And then he's using light and dark in other parts of the building. And this comes up again in another building of his that we'll look at. But I feel that it's a very special building and worth a look. And the lobby is phenomenal. They don't like you to go in there, but you just go in and futz around for a minute and you'll see it. It's wonderful. So we go down the block again. This is to 30th Street. It's several blocks. On the walk down, you would pass a white glazed terracotta building. There's just terracotta all along. So I had to pick and choose, and I picked the Silk Traders building, which is kind of, I have to say it's kind of a simple building, but it's unfortunately been made a lot more simple by the fact that it's been modernized, and you can see it in the ground floor. You can see it in this cornice, so to speak, and of course at the top. This is a George and Edward Blum building. It's one of their commercial buildings. They did many, but most of them are in the garment district. This is interesting because it has a nice treatment of brick that is used in all of the window spandrels, and it gives a rhythm to the entire facade. The upper levels have terracotta, and there was more originally on the building. And it has shields that have the initials ST for Silk Trader. I'd like one of those for my own. It has my initials, so it'd be nice to have a shield, but not anytime soon. So we will see more Blum work, and we will see more use of brick by them. So keep this very simple building in mind. We go down the block to 29th now on Park Avenue South to the Green Central Building. It's a corner building. It's very freestanding because what's next to it is small, and it has a very nice presence, as does the building we'll look at after, which you can see a little bit here. It's a red brick building, also a corner on 29th Street, and also freestanding and very strong. What's nice to see is in the black and white picture, there's a lot of what we might call modeling, and maybe uneven flashes and so on the surface of the solid blocks. And that was produced to give you a feeling that the clay might be stone. There's a tremendous ability for clay to mimic other materials. And it was certainly used frequently to mimic stone. They even developed glazes that looked like granite that they called Granitex. So this is just one example of trying to look like stone, but terracotta is also used to look like windows for glass and for wood. It's quite a good material for mimicking. The upper portions of this building have very nice motifs that are semi-Persian and also a little Deco. It's a kind of interesting combination, and a couple of very sorry looking chickens or turkeys are also on the facade. If you go inside, and I think I haven't been in a while, but I think they're a little more relaxed, you can see some of the terracotta that's in there. There's not a whole lot, but this is an example, and it's around the elevator. So that's worth keeping in mind. We move across the street to the Block Building, Woolworth Building, which is also very freestanding. And you can see just a general sense of the areas where there's terracotta, these three areas, and also down at the base is a very nice base. What I'd like you to notice is the fenestration. The windows are still intact, and it just is glorious to have the feeling that there's some kind of sense to the windows instead of a blank sheet of glass. Also interesting is how flat this ornament is. It's only 1927, and ornament tends to get streamlined in the early 30s, but this is a precursor to that, and it's quite nice to see. It's also quirky in that you have these semicircles and a circle in it, semicircle and circle, and they're occurring up at the top here, and that's is quite unusual. Many times I've passed the building, and I used to live near there, and one of the times I passed it was scaffolded, and this piece was on the ground, and it's cast stone, which was disheartening because it's a replacement piece that uses a substitute material. If you can picture, let's just say, this piece needing to be removed because it was badly broken, and this piece of concrete put in place, what tends to happen is that the materials function differently in the climate and heat and cold, and it's not a great idea. It saves money, but it's not a great idea to use substitute materials for terracotta repair. Right next door, and you can even still see the Woolworth brick building, is a small building that was originally the fast food self-service restaurant. And here's a little ad for it, and the double F. The The name is up here in gold. It's extremely hard to see, and these upper stories have been painted. I don't know what they were originally. Maybe black, because the window frames are black, maybe. But this gives you a nice sense of some of the lower ornamental details and the very definite Deco feeling that happens in this building. Okay, we're going to move on, even though my mouse likes to go backwards. We're going to move forward. And what we're going to do is walk down 29th Street West from Park Avenue South to Madison Avenue to take a look at this 16-story, really powerful building. It's called the Emmett Building, and Dr. Thomas Addis Emmett was the owner of this building. He was a doctor who began practice in the 1860s and occupied a succession of houses and offices on the east side of Madison Avenue, just south of 29th Street. He acquired a number of buildings, and in 1912, he erected this commercial structure with an apartment for himself at the very top of the building. Brick Builder magazine praised the building's exquisite propriety, obviously commercial, but with the distinction which everyone wants in his own private home. And of course, only Dr. Emmett was going to get, since he was the only one living there. There's extraordinary details on this Gothic, sort of neo-Gothic facade. There are ornamented sculptures, as you can see. These are down low, and up high are all kinds of shields and crests and foliage, and it's really a full terracotta statement. And there's one woman who's owned it for a long time, and I think she's taken good care of it. She's quite possessive about it. All right, we're going to move down one block west to Fifth Avenue. And here is 261 Fifth Avenue. This is another Ely Jacques Kahn building. It's less, for me, it's less unified than 2 Park Avenue. And if you look, it's hard to see, but you'll see a detail. There's ornament at this point in the facade, and then down at the base, and a couple of stories above the base. But I don't feel there's anything really connecting the elements, and particularly when you see the details, you may agree with me. So the upper stories have this very nice red, green, and orangish terracotta, and the lower stories have a much softer kind of a gray, black, gold, and then a kind of orange. I don't really feel that they work together on the facade, but I did want to point out a number of things. First, that the building has been unfortunately restored and not well recently, so the dirt that you see throughout would not be visible anymore. It would be much cleaner. In fact, the right slide is more recent, and you can see how much cleaner it is. Note these 3 buildings, which are down around 27th to 26th Street. All of them are using terracotta, not exclusively, because I can see a little brick in the middle one. Then we look at the lower detail. I wanted to mention that this ornament has some of the same linear qualities that we saw in 2 Park Avenue, where it's one color, but light and dark is going to be created by the sculpting of the surface and the shadows of light and dark. Also, as let's see, low key as the gray is a real contrast with the high keyed gold, which is a luster glaze that can be put on after the regular firing. You can apply the luster or the gold metallic, and then refire at a low temperature so that that will be relatively permanent, but will not affect the other glazes. So we will move on to a building you will all recognize. It's a beloved icon, and it's the Woolworth Building. This building I love, but if you look, the lower 3 stories are stone, and you can see it because this is the rounded curve right here. And that's on the 3rd floor. So the stone is here and the terracotta begins above. Everything above this area is terracotta, and not only on the building because there's also a lot of brick, but in this image, you don't see any brick. I want to point out that if you look for joints in the stone, here's a joint. Actually, it's a break. Sorry. Let's see, here's a joint. And I think there was a joint here, but there's also a break. This is a very big piece, okay? Not a lot of frequent joints. That may help you to recognize that it's stone, not terracotta. You can continue. These are nice, large pieces of stone. You see a joint here, joint here, joint here. And when you look at it and you look at the terracotta above, you see a joint, a joint, a joint, a joint. So that helps you realize these are smaller pieces. They may be terracotta. Also notice this is well over 100 years old. How crisp this is. Just so fresh and crisp, not so clean, but it's going to be restored. It's actually, I think, scaffolded now. So we'll be looking at some interesting new work over time when the building is uncovered again. Here we take a walk, a jog east, and we are, I love my new mouse. Naughty, amazing. Okay, this is on 22nd Street. So from 23rd, we would walk east on 22nd Street to see the Mabel Dean Bacon Vocational High School, which was originally the Manhattan Trade School for Girls. It's an early school by C.B.J. Schneider, the superintendent of school buildings for New York City, and an architect known for his great variety of public school buildings designed during his tenure. Many of them are landmarked. This is not. The entire facade is white terracotta except for the ground floor. And it's using a funny or nice collegiate Gothic style architecture with a loft mentality. And it's interesting because the blend was appropriate for the building in which students were learning trades related to the garment district and industry, which was really primarily located in lofts in the East 30s. Above the 10th story windows, which is just where the cornice comes, are a series of gargoyles that are wonderful. They hold books and tools, and you can see one of them here. Below is the actual original piece that came out of the building and was sent to Gladding McBean, and above is a reproduction that was sculpted at Gladding McBean. You will notice that the reproduction is larger. It must be, because when it's fired and glazed, it will shrink, and it's got to be planned to shrink to the size that will fit perfectly into the facade. You also have a nice, very nice Gothic lettering in terracotta, very crisp for the building. It's, I would like to see it landmarked. I think that a little extra something to do. As we move on 22nd Street, we move to another George and Edward Blum building, the apartment house from 1929 to 1930. If you look at the corner of the building, all of the corners actually, the bricks are very apparent. And what they've done is they've taken the brick and they use, and I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but 2 bricks to make the corner, and the next brick sticks out, and then 2 bricks to make the corner, and then 1 sticking out. And that created this kind of texture along the corners. I think this is a really very beautiful building, and I'd like you to notice in the overview that there's a darker brick, and then terracotta, and then a lighter brick with terracotta bands. And this looks to me, it could be original, but I just don't know whether the top was changed or not. The historic photographs don't make it clear. This is a pretty old picture, but it could have been removed earlier. I doubt it though. This is a detail of the doorway on one side, and you can get to see not only the kind of galloping chevron border, but a lot of different kinds of details, almost tassels and so on in the Blum building. It's also great to notice the terracotta color for the lower floor, and then the brick that's light, but it's not as light as you'll see next. Here's the much lighter brick above. So you get the sense of the contrast and this wonderful terracotta swerving along the building. I will mention that on the back is a band of terracotta high up, but it's a solid color with a chevron motif. I don't know quite why it's a solid color. It would have saved money, and so that's one possibility. We move now a little bit south and west to Gramercy Park. We'll look at 2 more buildings and we will have completed our walk. This is 36 Gramercy Park. Friends of Terra Cotta was able around 1980 to help get this building added to the Gramercy Park Historic District. So it is a landmark. It's hard to see the entrance, which is amusing. There are 2 cement knights in painted silver, a very ornate entryway, very nice groovy tile floors inside. For many years, until fairly recently, the building was a rental, and then it was purchased. And it's undergone a recent, very successful restoration. But for many years, it was dirty, and you can see a lot of dirt on this detail. You can also see the crazing that I pointed out earlier as we were thinking about identifying buildings. And from this picture, I'll just show you that 34, which is from 1883, is next door, and we'll look at that in a minute. This is an example of what's actually being a terracotta installed from Boston Valley Terracotta in Buffalo, New York. They did a beautiful job, and Dan Allen was the architect for that. He's the president of the Historic Districts Council. And the piece that's lying next to the Bambino is the piece that's now installed. So it's lying down. These pieces were taken and used to recreate new pieces, and the right size. They shrank to the right size, and here you can see the installation. We'll now move to our last building, one of my favorites. I lived here for a number of years, and it was a very special experience. First, get a sense of the 2 buildings. So you have 34 here, and you have 36. And what you see in the first image on the bottom to the left is that 34 is standing by itself with nothing near it. In the image on the right, there's a small building. And then by 1912, we ended up with a very nice large building. It was actually 1910 to 12. So this building may have stayed up, the smaller one, until 1908, but that's as long as it lasted. There are a number of things I want to point out about the Gramercy. Partly the fact that it has bands, and it's very hard to see. We have a drawing, but it's still difficult, of terracotta all the way along the building. We also have brick. Most of the building is red brick, and we have brownstone. And we'll look at that more closely. So again, you have the whole building, the lower air floor, and around the doorway is brownstone. And we looked at a detail of this before, the defoliating brownstone, and then the terracotta. So it's at this level that this photograph was taken, showing the male Indian with his feathered headdress and the female Indian with her headdress of corn. I don't know whether that's feminist or anti-feminist. I won't go into it. But I do love these creatures that sit on the building. I don't know exactly what they are, but looks like billy goats maybe with horns. So 36 and 34 couldn't be more different in all kinds of ways. The terracotta that you're looking at here is unglazed, and it's a reddish brown and very, very strange. The ornament is very unusual, and I have not been able to identify the manufacturer, but the main thing that's surprising about it is that it's quite flat. Yes, the noses and the cheeks come out, but it's relatively flat compared to the Bambino 36 that we just looked at, and all of the more elaborate and sculpted ornament that we have come across, certainly the Emmett Building. And I believe that it may actually be English terracotta. I have no very good reason for saying that, except that it's not like anything else. And the interior of the building has wonderful tiles from varied companies. All of them were English. So it's possible that this is actually English. It's a great mystery, and I hope someday it will get solved. If you take the walk up the steps, boldly enter the outer lobby. It has stained glass, incredible tile that's faux mosaic, and something called Encrustia Walton, which is a version of an imitation, I should say, of pressed leather. And it's just an incredible lobby. You can peek into the inner space also, which is the inner lobby. And it was a very special experience to live there, but I'm really happy on the Upper West Side. I would be more than happy to take any kinds of questions that come up, and Laura is going to help me to be able to get questions and answers, and I'll do the answers, you do the questions. How about that?
Well, Susan, thank you so much. This was wonderful. I'm just going to start preparing for the Q&A. We've got great questions here. To start, I'm just going to ask everyone, if you're inclined to do so, turn your video on for the Q&A. And while people are doing that, if they feel like doing that, I think the first question is going to be, how did you first get interested in terracotta?
It's twofold. Actually, I was living at 34 Gramercy Park, and I would look out the windows at the park, but also at the building. And I kept seeing squares that looked well, they kind of looked like brick. They matched the brick, but they were ornamental. They were geometric. They were not what I've shown you. Simple squares. And I began to think that maybe that's clay because it looks like clay. And at the same time, I was teaching a school of visual arts, and I was teaching ceramics, wanted the students to recognize the fact that there was clay around them. And it's Gramercy Park is just a block away. So we looked at a number of buildings, many with tile, to try and get the students interested in thinking about architectural ceramics. And so as I became interested in all of this, it all sort of happened at the same time. Our daughter was old enough to get out of the stroller, so I stopped looking down. I'd been looking down for the first few years, avoiding dog poop and stuff. And I started to look up, and it was just very exciting. What I realized was that ceramicists tend to have an inferiority complex. The field has one. Currently, there's a kind of resurgence of ceramics as art, which is a very new development. But for the most of the last couple of 100 years, ceramics has been relegated to craft. And I felt that if people who make things in clay knew that buildings like the Woolworth Building were made out of clay, that they would realize that they're dealing with a very profound and special material, and they don't need to feel like they're pigeonholed into a craft. So I felt that it's something I should share with the ceramics community, and all of that kind of came together. Very long answer, sorry.
Absolutely not. It was a great answer. Another question, it's actually my own question, coming from another country that speaks another language. We use, where I'm from, a lot of clay tiles as roof material. And it took me a while to realize that that's terracotta. Is there any difference in the production, or is just a different term that is used to identify terracotta used as surfaces and decoration and clay roof tiles?
It's a very good question. And usually when I have more time, I talk about the difference between tile and terracotta. In this particular case, roof tile is really a third subject, because tile that's typically glazed and used for floors or walls or lobbies or a trivet comes from tile manufacturers. There are some companies that do everything, like Rookwood, but generally roof tiles are made by roof tile manufacturers. And there's a very famous one called Ludovici Celadon, and they're still in business. They've been in business since the late 1800s, and they produce both glazed and unglazed roof tile, much of it historic because they do a lot of replacement. And it's, again, another sub-industry. So you'd sort of say that bricks an industry, tiles an industry, roof tiles an industry, and architectural terracotta. They sometimes overlap, though.
Great. Thank you. Now, talking about industry, we know that there are probably just two major terracotta manufacturers nowadays. Do you have any idea how many were in the heyday of terracotta?
Sure, we know all of them. There were 48. And, it was a booming industry that was sort of focused around geography and clay beds. So you had East Coast, Midwest, particularly Chicago, and West Coast. And today, we do have other manufacturers. In England, there's a very good company that's had some bumps, but they're working well now. And it's they've changed the name a lot of times. I think it's called Blashfield, but they may have changed it yet again. And so England is producing good material and is shipping some to the US for restoration. And there's very good companies in Italy and in Spain. They don't, well, the Italian company has work in Soho down at the Nike store on Lower Broadway. But I haven't seen the Spanish material used yet in this country. So because every country sort of had a clay industry, there are quite a few manufacturers, but again, the two major ones in the US are Gladdy McBean in California and Boston Valley in Buffalo. And there are artisans who are making things, but it's not full-scale industry.
Right. And with that answer, you responded to another question of one of our attendees asking about Boston Valley. So now moving from manufacturers to buildings, the ones that you talked about.
Yeah.
Is the Della Robbia bar the ceiling of Vanderbilt's privatization, or was it something else?
No, it was intended as the men's crypt, a drinking room for men. It was not, the hotel had a lot of services and a lot of different things that were available. And this was just one of them. And it's kind of tucked in and you could enter from the street. So you could be coming and you could be someone who is meeting somebody at the hotel in that little space. It's not so little, but it actually, in the back of the Della Robbia bar are some indications of spaces that may have been part of the Della Robbia room itself. They're painted and there's very small amount left, but when we go back to historic images, there looks like the metalwork might be the same. So there are a few tiny remnants, but it's really, and the floor. But it's really a different situation altogether. The ornament, the type of ornament is generally similar to the Della Robbia bar, but much less, it's much more, less elaborate, let's say. The Della Robbia bar is less elaborate, even though it is very elaborate.
All right. Another question about a building that you talked about. Everyone commented on 2 Park, how breathtaking it was. But one of the questions were why those designs were put on a part of a building where people couldn't easily see.
That's it's a general question, because I've always had people say to me, why bother? It's, what's the deal? Woolworth or something less tall. And it's hard to say. I think in the case of Ely Jacques Kahn and the 2 Park Avenue building, he actually was so preoccupied about how the color would appear in the atmosphere that he had blocks of, I guess it was plaster, painted to the colors he wanted to use in glaze and put up at the height of the building where he would see them and decide if the color seemed right. So he was expecting people to look up and see the color. That's doable, but in a lot of places, it's not so doable. And I think it had to do with the architect selling the building to the owner. Here's a beautiful building. You'll be proud of it. And of course, what happened is that the city grew and grew and grew. And so a lot of people get to look out of windows at this ornament, which wasn't the case at the time. But I think it has to do with those factors. No one has ever been able to pin it down more clearly for me. And we've played with the question a lot.
Awesome. Just another question about a building, and then we'll move to the last question. This is about a building that you didn't talk about. Do you know if the Fred F. French building at 551 Fifth Avenue is terracotta?
Oh, yes. Oh, my God. It's the best example of looking up and seeing color and knowing it's terracotta. And for anyone who will do that, it's on 44th Street. Make sure you go to Fifth Avenue and you look across at the narrow side, because there's an amazing mural that no one ever sees of Mercury's head with wings on his helmet. And it's fabulous. So it's worth really examining that building. Yes, it was on the cover of the Terracotta Skyline, and it is really fabulous.
All right. So our last question for tonight. And before I ask this question, I'm going to let you know, if I didn't get to your question, please send an email. I'll send it over to Susan if you have any questions further after this. But now, Susan, can you talk a little bit about the renaissance of terracotta and facades that has been happening? And for an example, we have the great new green building in Chelsea.
Yes, oh, that's a beautiful building. Well, it's a tale of two sagas. One, new use of terracotta in very nice ways in many, many buildings. Annabelle Seldorf has used it in the Chelsea area, glazed and even bronze colored terracotta in a number of buildings. The building, I think, is Roman and Roman, the green building that's on 28th, I believe that you've mentioned. So there's this wonderful burgeoning of good ideas and new design. And then there's these skyscrapers, which are super tall, and two new ones, which I think I am exploring for the next mailing, because I'm not trying to ignore them. They're a lot too big to ignore. Using terracotta, now there's one Vanderbilt Place, and Boston Valley made the terracotta for that, and that's right near Grand Central Station. It's very large, and it has some fairly interesting terracotta on it. I think it'll be an interesting building. It's just being completed. And then there's the Steinway Tower on 57th Street, which is using terracotta made by, I think it's NBK in Germany or China. They have plants in both places. But that building is very, very thin. It's very narrow. And I worry that the sway will cause damage to the terracotta. It's being put up in panelized sections. So we will see. We've talked to the architects a number of times, and they swear they've taken care of the sway. Time will tell. So you have wonderful new buildings, and you have some that are maybe wonderful, but outsized and somewhat distressing to those of us who look at New York as a special architectural place. It's been hard to see them go up, and I don't know how many more will be going up, although they seem to be vacant or just owned by foreigners. So maybe there'll be a limit to how many gabillionaires there are. I don't know. Anyhow, I'm very, very happy about the increase of use of terracotta in new buildings. And I will just end with saying that England has done some staggeringly beautiful new modest sized glazed multicolored terracotta buildings, and it's exciting. I'm thrilled, and I hope that some of that excitement will reach more of New York's architects. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Susan. This was wonderful. We're very happy that you were able to taught us so many new things. And like I said, if everyone had any question, if I didn't get to your question on the chat, please send me an email. I'll be happy to send it over to Susan so we can respond. And with that, I thank everyone for being here, and hopefully we'll see you next time.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
thank you. Bye.